This time it's 5 wonderful classic 175s. There was a time when 175cc was an extremely popular capacity amongst lighter motorcycles, and in the UK this was very much the case of the taxation laws introduced during the 1930s. But as time went by and regulations for learner riders had restricted them to 125cc's, the 175 would fade into the background. But for this video we're going to look back and take a look at 5 wonderful classic 175s. The BSA Bantam B175. Now, as we all know, the BSA Bantam was originally based as a mirror image of the RT125 produced by DKW and was of 123cc's. This original version, the D1, appeared in 1948. But of course BSA would gradually increase the capacity, initially to 150cc's and then later in the D5 of 1958 to 175cc's, though retaining the 125's 3-speed gear cluster. This was quickly replaced a year later by the D7 with 7 horsepower, not surprisingly, but again with only 3 speeds. And this model would run until 1966 when it was replaced by the D10. This model again retained the 3-speed gearbox, but the D10 was quickly joined by the Sports Cub and the Bushman, both of which had a 4-speed cluster. 1968 would see the arrival of the D14-4. As the name suggests, this was 14, although actually 13 horsepower and a 4-speed gearbox, and this machine would have a tested top speed of 64 miles an hour in 1968. It would also have high compression both in the crankcase and at the top end of the motor, so it was surprisingly difficult to start, and unfortunately was also probably the most unreliable of all the Bantam range. However, in 1969 BSA would introduce the B175 and the B175 Bushman to run alongside it. This would have the compression ratio at the top end drop slightly to 9.5 to 1, and this, as well as improvements in the bottom end, would provide the new bike with smoother running, greater reliability and a nicer all-round performance. Today the Bantam is an increasingly popular classic, and indeed many have been modified for use in pre-65 trials, a role for which the machine is very well suited. And this unfortunately means that the prices of a good Bantam have become surprisingly high. The CZ Model 450. CZ was established as an arms manufacturer in the former Czechoslovakia, although they would later produce motor cars, bicycles, motorcycles of course, and even farm machinery and tractors. And their motorcycle production was very large scale. In fact, they were the second largest manufacturer of motorcycles in Europe in the post-war era, producing a range of 4-stroke motorcycles, scooters, and of course 2-stroke motorcycles of 250 and 350 parallel twins, and of course the 175 and 125 single-cylinder 2-strokes. And indeed their use of 2-stroke technology was second only perhaps to MZ during the 1950s and 60s, an era when they became the first 2-stroke motorcycle to win a top-class motocross Grand Prix and would go on to win a hatful of Grand Prix World Championships too. The CZ175 used a single-cylinder, 2-stroke, piston-ported, air-cooled motor with 4-speed transmission. And while early models were only said to produce around 8 horsepower, with their flexible motor and 4-speed transmission they could still reach speeds in excess of 60 miles an hour. However, during the long production run of the 175, its 172cc motor would be gradually upgraded and improved, although it would retain a 4-speed gearbox for much of its production. And by the 1970s, when this very popular trail model was produced, the engine was kicking out around 15 horsepower, and was even available with automatic oiling, something that many more expensive machines of the time did not feature. But however, by the 1980s, CZ's market share was beginning to shrink, and the market itself in Europe was beginning to contract considerably also. And of course the financial collapse of the Eastern Bloc countries would leave them in major problems. In 1993 they would be taken over by Cagiva, but unfortunately this venture was not successful, and the company went out of production in 1997. Giletti Jubileo. Italian company Giletti was founded in 1909, and in 1935 the company acquired the rights for the CNA Rondine. This was a 4-cylinder dual overhead cam Grand Prix racing bike, a machine which, when fitted with a compressor, produced 80 horsepower and at a top speed of around 140 miles an hour. And this would form the basis of Giletti's Grand Prix bikes for many years to come, although of course post-war it would not be fitted with a supercharging unit. Giletti's Jubileo was introduced initially as a 100cc model, then later upgraded to 125 before being enlarged to 175 in 1964. The engine was a single-cylinder air-cooled 4-stroke unit of 175cc that produced 10 horsepower at 7,000 rpm through a 4-speed gearbox, and like so many Italian bikes at the time, was exquisitely designed and beautifully engineered, with unit construction and wet sump lubrication. But of course all this meant that the exquisitely built Giletti was very expensive, and so not surprisingly sales were fairly slow outside of its native Italy. Although of course to help drum up sales, some Gilettis were marketed under the Ward's Riverside banner in the United States. However, the company did continue to struggle financially, and so in 1969 were taken over by scooter giant Piaggio, the year in which production of the 175 ended. Kawasaki K175. I'll just change things up. I think it's time for a Japanese 2-stroke, and what could be better than a nice Kawasaki K175. This bike was introduced in 1976, but of course was a development of earlier models. Unlike its predecessors, the KE used a 2-stroke single-cylinder engine with rotary valve induction. The engine was of 174cc and had a bore and stroke of 61.5 by 58.8. Compression ratio was 7:1, and there was a Makino 26mm slide carburetor. And Kawasaki would claim that the engine produced 21 horsepower or 15.6 kilowatts at 7,000 rpm. This was then put through a 6-speed gearbox and out to the rear wheels, both of which were stopped by drum brakes. And this meant that the very lightweight machine of just 102 kilos or 225 pounds was quite a useful off-road tool, and to that end it had a 21-inch front wheel and an 18-inch rear, and had a seat height of 845mm or 53.5 inches, so short riders need not apply, although the seat at least is a little bit narrow, so it may give you a reasonable chance if you're somewhat less than 6 foot. And the machine would go on to have a great reputation as a really usable off-road motorbike, and was said in many ways to be superior to many of the 250 offerings from other companies, and indeed from Kawasaki themselves. 1980 would see Kawasaki release the machine's obvious replacement, the KDX range. But such was the popularity of this simple twin-shock 175 that production would continue for another 2 years, before finally ending in 1982. Puk SVS 175. Now I know before we start we're going to get complaints because I'm pronouncing the bike as Pooch. The fact is that most people in Britain tend to call these bikes thus. Now I know it's not the correct pronunciation, but I'm afraid old habits die hard, and after all, we don't moan when Americans call a Jaguar a Jaguar. Why? Because English people are too polite and we just smile and nod. Now Pooch, German pronunciation Pux, was founded in 1889 and is an Austrian company of course, which of course produces all sorts of vehicles, including cars, trucks, and in days gone by of course mopeds and motorcycles. They're probably best known for their mopeds of the 1970s such as the Maxi. Now the SVS 175 was produced during the 1960s and is a 2-stroke split single or twingle, running 2 pistons on a single conrod with 1 combustion chamber. Confused? I don't blame you. Now twingles were very popular for a time, especially amongst German and Austrian companies, because they were basically more efficient than standard 2-strokes. Production of the SVS would run through the 1950s, gaining a swinging arm suspension system in 1954. However, by the mid-60s, the conventional 2-stroke had pretty much overtaken the split singles, so manufacturers simply couldn't justify the extra weight and of course production cost of the split single engine. What bikes or collections of bikes would you like to see a future video on? Or perhaps you've got a bike we can feature in a road test in the future. Either way, get in touch. Do hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course thank you very much for watching.